So we're continuing with the topic of conserving biodiversity, and we have completed the slides on preserving biodiversity by protecting species or small groups of species. Now I'm going to walk through the conservation of biodiversity, which focuses on protecting an entire ecosystem. And as we go through this, we're going to use the analogy of an island. So imagine that when we're protecting biodiversity, that ecosystem that we're protecting is an island, and the ocean surrounding it is not ocean, actually, it's human activity. And we'll look at how the size of the island, the shape of the island, the distance of the island to the mainland or other islands, and the amount of human activity swirling around it affects the success of that approach. So, when you consider protecting biodiversity by preserving an ecosystem, we need to look at the size, the shape, and the connectedness of that ecosystem or imaginary island. And there's an acronym for this. It's SLOSS. It means should we have several large or several small islands or preserves? Which one is better? Well, they both have their pros and cons. And we can figure out the pros and cons of single large or several small preserves by going through the theory of island biogeography. So we need to consider a couple of points. How close are the islands to one another? How large is an individual island? And the amount of edge habitat the area contains. So let's go back a step. You may recall from lab and from other lectures about edge habitat. So edge habitats are typically higher in biodiversity, and it's an area where two different ecosystems that are dramatically different meet. So you might have a grass field and a forest, and in between the large grass field and the large forest is a very small area, not nearly as deep as the other two. That's called edge habitat, and it's high in biodiversity because it includes organisms, particularly plants of different sizes, so maybe a lot of shrubs, and those habitats, those edge habitats, help one another. So you might have birds in the forest right on the edge, feeding on seeds in the grassland right beyond it, etc. It might provide shade, windbreak, many other things. So edge habitat is a positive thing, and it increases biodiversity. So let's picture several islands. I wish I could draw them on the board for you here, but we're doing this remotely. So maybe draw for yourself a couple of tiny islands off of the mainland. And then maybe draw one big island off the mainland. So with a bunch of tiny islands, we have more edge habitat. So that would be a positive thing. If we have one large island, we would not have the edge habitat, but we would have a lot more room for organisms to move around, to have territory, to have enough habitat for mating with different populations and increasing the genetic pool, much more room for nesting opportunities, much more room for feeding opportunities. So that would give the plus to the larger island. Some other considerations would be what will happen if some natural disaster or a man-made disaster, but let's look at natural disaster comes through. So if you had, let's say, 5 smaller islands and a hurricane comes through and took out one island completely, the other 4 islands might all survive, and then they therefore could eventually re-inhabit the other island, and at least they would not have been wiped out. If you have one larger island and it's the bullseye for the hurricane, it could wipe out the entire island. So they both have pros and cons, but what do we decide when we're looking at our current situation? Well, currently we don't have a choice. There really are very few areas where we can now preserve an ecosystem as a single large ecosystem. So we're generally left with several small ecosystems, even though probably the balance would go toward the single large being better, but we can manage the several small to maximize their success. So when we have a single small area, one of the things that we want to do is have a zonation system where the amount of human activity goes from no human activity, little bit of activity, some activity, lots of activity, so that island in the sea, if you will, is not surrounded totally by human activity. So typically you would have a core area where very little could happen, maybe some monitoring, and then a buffer zone where perhaps you could have people doing studies, um, people going into that ecosystem as a responsible hiker, a transition area where you might even be able to have some type of activity taking place, but spread apart, and again, not dense settlement. And then you have the outer part of the ocean here where all kinds of tourism could take place. So right here we have just limited tourism and recreation. For example, education and training over here, a research station over here, and human settlements in very small quantities here and here. So today there are 564 biosphere reserves worldwide. Of these, 47 are located in the United States. Most of those are in states like California, Alaska, Colorado. We do have one here in the New England area. It's in the White Mountains. It's called Hubbard Brook, and it studies Hubbard Brook National Forest, excuse me, and there they conduct forestry studies and look at aquatic ecosystems as well. The only other major one that I know of on the East Coast is in New Jersey, the Pinelands, which you might have heard of before. And of course, we also have smaller things like state parks. So a review of the key concepts. Unfortunately, we are in the midst of a sixth great extinction, and this one may be caused by human activities. There are different levels of endangerment, so you should be able to define the levels of endangerment and provide some examples of organisms that fall or species which fall in those levels of endangerment. You should understand that amphibians, mammals, and birds are not equally threatened. You should understand the importance of genetic diversity and the fact that if we decrease a population to a critical point, generally less than 400 individuals, inbreeding depression will occur, and that species is far less likely to survive. And big time here, you should understand HIPCO, the 5 major factors, all of which are driven by human populations and human population size that are causing the declines in biodiversity that we are seeing. One thing I don't have on here, you should also remember that the decline in biodiversity is occurring both in wild organisms, wild animals, etc., and in our food supply. And the last point is how we are approaching the conservation of biodiversity. There's the species, single species or small group of species approach, and the ecosystem approach. And also consider humans' valuation of biodiversity and its intrinsic value and its instrumental value.